Go on then, start her up. The voice was smooth, dripping with the kind of condescending amusement only found in a young officer fully convinced of his own importance. Captain Davis punctuated his words with a dismissive flick of his wrist toward the massive A-10 Thunderbolt II. Its bulky, aggressive shape rested heavily on the hot tarmac. Show us how it's done, old-timer. Major Amy Bennett, 38 years old, offered no reply. She stood beside the aircraft's enormous front landing gear, her hand gently resting on the cool rubber of the tire. The sun beat relentlessly down on the flight line, causing the air to shimmer above the concrete. She wore a faded leather jacket, cracked and deeply worn, in a way that spoke only of decades of deployment, despite the sweltering heat. A small group of young airmen, taking a break from their duties during the base's annual family day, had gathered nearby. They exchanged uneasy glances, caught between the discomfort of witnessing a middle-aged veteran being mocked and the ingrained reluctance to challenge a captain. Davis smirked, playing to his small audience. Come on now. You were telling my guys here all about the good old days, how you used to fly these things by the seat of your pants. Surely you remember how to flip a few switches. He directed a manicured finger toward the complex array of instruments visible through the A-10's bubble canopy. Or is all that newfangled glass a bit too much for you? Amy's eyes, the muted color of a faded sky, remained fixed on the aircraft. She was not observing the modern cockpit. Instead, her gaze was locked on the nose, just beneath the canopy, where the paint showed slightly more wear. She was looking specifically at the massive 7-barreled maw of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon that defined the very identity of the plane. It was a weapon she knew more intimately than she knew the faces of some of her own relatives. She could physically feel the familiar, bone-jarring vibration of it firing, a profound memory that resided not in her mind, but deep within her bones. "Captain," one of the younger airmen started, a faint hint of protest in his voice. "Maybe we should just stay out of it, airman," Davis snapped, his eyes never leaving Amy. "The woman wants to tell war stories. She should be able to back them up. What's the matter, Grandma? Forget which key goes in the ignition?" He chuckled at his own weak joke. A few of the others nervously shuffled their feet, the silence growing heavier than the humid air. The captain stepped closer, his shadow falling over Amy. He jabbed a thumb toward a worn patch on her jacket, a crudely drawn scorpion encased within a circle of sand. "What's that supposed to be? Your VFW bingo team?" Amy's gaze finally shifted from the plane to the captain. She did not look angry, nor did she appear humiliated. She looked exhausted. Her eyes scanned the captain's polished boots, his crisply ironed flight suit, and the gleaming silver bars on his collar. She saw a man wearing a uniform who had absolutely no concept of the ultimate price it could demand. A man who saw a living legend standing before him and perceived only a nuisance. "The auxiliary power unit requires a ground check before the ignition sequence," Amy said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp, directed not to the captain, but to the A-10 itself. "Hydraulic pressure needs to be stable at 3,000 psi. You don't just turn a key." The sheer technical accuracy of her statement seemed to momentarily disarm Davis. He quickly recovered, his smirk instantly reappearing. "Oh, we've got a real expert here. Look, ma'am, this is a restricted area. The aircraft is a static display for the event. I'm going to have to ask you to please step away and let my people get back to work." He changed his tone, adopting the slow, loud cadence of someone addressing a child or a person they believed to be senile. "This is a very expensive, very dangerous airplane. We can't have civilians climbing all over it." Amy's hand dropped from the tire. Her posture remained unchanged, but a profound stillness settled over her, the kind of absolute calm that typically precedes a storm. Amy had been an honored guest of the base commander, invited to the family day as one of the wing's original pilots. She had simply wandered out to the flight line to be near the machine that had served as her partner, her shield, and her primary weapon throughout the most harrowing days of her life. She hadn't spoken until Davis's young airman had approached her with genuine curiosity. inquiring about her jacket. It was Davis who had interrupted them, his ego bristling at the sight of his subordinates giving their attention to a perceived relic. "I'm not a civilian," Amy said quietly. Davis let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Right, and I'm the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again. My patience is wearing thin. Show me your visitor pass, and then please head back to the public area." The demand was an undisguised insult, clearly implying that Amy was an unescorted wanderer who had trespassed onto the active flight line. The crowd was now larger, with families and other personnel drawn by the confrontation, watching the drama unfold from a respectful distance. Davis was clearly enjoying the attention, viewing this as a simple matter of enforcing regulations and putting a perceived nuisance in her place. He had no idea he was standing on consecrated ground, in the presence of one of the legendary figures of this domain of steel and fire. "You want to see my credentials?" Amy asked, her voice still low, but now with a sharp edge of steel. "That's exactly what I want," Davis confirmed, crossing his arms. "Let's see some ID. Let's see the pass that allows you to be this close to a United States Air Force asset." Amy slowly reached into the inner pocket of her jacket. Her movements were deliberate, completely unhurried. She was not reaching for a simple wallet. Davis's smug expression began to falter, instantly replaced by a flicker of genuine uncertainty. What could this woman possibly have in her jacket that could fundamentally alter this situation? For a moment, a wild, paranoid thought flashed through the captain's mind. Was this some kind of security threat? He instinctively placed a hand near his hip, closer to where a sidearm would be if he were security police. "Empty your pockets, slowly." The crowd began to murmur. The situation had suddenly escalated from casual mockery into a tense, unpredictable standoff. The young airman who had tried to intervene earlier now looked noticeably pale, realizing the incident was spiraling dangerously out of control. As Amy's hand emerged from her jacket, Davis's eyes were fixed on it. But it was the patch on the jacket, the one he had just ridiculed, that held the key, the faded scorpion. The sand-colored stitching seemed to blur for a moment. In Amy's mind, the oppressive heat of the tarmac was instantly replaced by the biting cold of a high-altitude cockpit. The murmuring of the crowd faded, drowned out by the high-pitched whine of two General Electric turbofan engines and the crackle of the radio in her helmet. The world was not a peaceful airbase. It was a chaotic desert valley, a kill box crawling with enemy tanks. She could see them through her targeting pod. Republican Guard T-72s dug in, waiting to ambush a column of American light infantry. The radio was screaming, a young voice panicked and desperate. "Any air support in the area? This is Ranger 6 Actual. We are pinned down, taking heavy fire. We are being overrun." Amy's thumb depressed the trigger stud on her control stick. The world outside dissolved into the singular, violent roar of the Avenger cannon. A solid stream of 30mm depleted uranium shells, a fire hose of incandescent metal, slammed into the earth. The ground erupted. Tank turrets were ripped from their hulls. The memory was a physical sensation. The aircraft bucking, the acrid smell of burnt propellant filling the cockpit, and the grim satisfaction of watching the threats to the men on the ground evaporate into fireballs of black smoke. She remembered seeing the flash of a surface-to-air missile, the jolt of the impact against her right wing, the frantic dance on the rudder pedals to keep the crippled beast flying. That was the day she had earned the patch. It wasn't a unit insignia. It was a gift. A blood debt paid forward by a grateful army captain who swore he owed his life and the lives of his men to the Warthog that had descended from the sky like an angry god. Amy's eyes refocused on the present, on Captain Davis's arrogant, ignorant face. She had heard enough. One of the airmen in the crowd, a senior airman named Garcia who worked in aircraft maintenance, had been watching the exchange with a growing sense of dread. Garcia was a history buff. He knew the tail numbers of the historically significant planes in the wing, and he knew the stories attached to them. When he saw the woman standing next to tail 78, 61 Teat, wearing the non-standard scorpion patch, A forgotten piece of trivia from his technical training clicked in his mind. He didn't know the woman's name, but he knew the legend of the pilot who had flown that specific Warthog, the one they called Deadeye. While Captain Davis was puffing out his chest and demanding to see a visitor's pass, Garcia slipped quietly away from the crowd. He pulled out his cell phone, his fingers flying across the screen. He didn't call security, knowing that would only worsen the situation. He called the one person on the base who would understand the potential gravity of the scene. Command Chief Master Sergeant Wallace, the highest-ranking enlisted person in the wing, a man who respected history more than he respected rank. The phone was answered on the second ring. "Chief Wallace." "Chief, this is Senior Airman Garcia from the 355th AMXS, he said, his voice low and urgent. He quickly described the scene. "Sir, Captain Davis is publicly harassing a veteran out by Warthog 6 Wing Teen. He's being incredibly disrespectful. The thing is, Chief, the woman is wearing a sand scorpion patch and she's standing next to Deadeye's plane." There was a moment of dead silence on the other end of the line. Garcia could hear the faint sound of a chair scraping back, the rustle of papers. When the chief spoke again, his voice was tight, stripped of all pleasantries. "What is the veteran's name, Airman?" "I don't know, Chief. The captain won't let anyone talk to her. He's treating her like a trespasser." "Stay there. Do not engage. Do not let that captain move the veteran. I am on my way, and I'm bringing the colonel." The line went dead. Garcia looked back at the scene. Davis, emboldened by Amy's continued silence, was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. The audience could now sense it in the air. Help was coming. Justice was on its way. Inside the wing headquarters building, Chief Wallace didn't bother knocking. He burst into the office of the wing commander, Colonel Matt, a man known for being calm, collected, and utterly unflappable. Matt was in a meeting with staff, discussing logistics for an upcoming deployment. "Sir, you need to see this," Wallace said, his voice cutting sharply through the quiet discussion. He strode to the colonel's desk and spun a laptop around, a single web page already loaded. It was the base's digital historical archive, open to a page dedicated to Operation Desert Storm. On the screen was a grainy, sun-bleached photo of a much younger pilot, a determined woman with dark hair, grinning as she leaned against the fuselage of an A-10. Underneath the photo was a name: Major Amy Deadeye Bennett. The profile listed her accomplishments, her airframe, A-10 78061T, and her last known status as retired, living in the local area. "Chief, what is the meaning of this?" the colonel asked, his voice laced with annoyance at the interruption. "Airman Garcia just called from the flight line. Captain Davis is publicly harassing an older woman he assumes is a lost civilian. The woman is standing next to that exact Warthog. Garcia says she's wearing the non-regulation sand scorpion patch mentioned in the after-action reports." Colonel Matt's face went through a rapid series of transformations. Annoyance became confusion, then dawning comprehension, and finally a deep and profound horror. He stared at the picture on the screen, then at his chief. The color drained from his face. He knew the name. Every A-10 pilot knew the name Deadeye Bennett. She was a ghost, a legend from the war that had defined the Warthog's reputation. A person who had done things with that aircraft that were still taught as case studies in tactical genius and raw courage at the Air Force Academy. "Get the command vehicle," Colonel Matt said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He was already on his feet, grabbing his flight cap from his desk. The staff officers in the room sat in stunned silence. "Tell the driver, no speed limits, and get me a direct line to the tower. I want that flight line cleared of all non-essential personnel." Back on the tarmac, Captain Davis had reached the peak of his hubris. Amy's quiet defiance had infuriated him. He saw it as a final, pathetic act of stubbornness. "All right, that's it. I've had enough of this game," Davis announced to the crowd as much as to Amy. "You refuse to identify yourself. You refuse to follow a lawful order to leave a restricted area. You've left me no choice." He gestured to two of his young airmen. "You two, Go get security forces. Tell them we have a situation, a trespasser, possibly confused, who needs to be escorted from the base. And while you're at it, he added, his voice dripping with spite, tell them to have medical on standby. We might need to get this gentlewoman a mandatory evaluation. The threat was the final nail in his coffin. He wasn't just removing a perceived nuisance anymore. He was threatening to strip Amy of her dignity, to have her forcibly removed and declared mentally incompetent, all for the crime of standing next to her own airplane. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This had turned ugly, a public humiliation that felt deeply and fundamentally wrong. It was at that precise moment that the wail of a siren cut through the air. It wasn't the familiar yelp of a security police cruiser, it was the deeper, more authoritative siren of a command vehicle. Heads turned as a black SUV, its emergency lights flashing, tore onto the tarmac at a speed that was strictly forbidden. It skidded to a halt just yards from the A-10, kicking up a cloud of dust. A maintenance truck screeched to a stop right behind it. The doors of the SUV flew open. Colonel Matt emerged, his face a thundercloud of controlled rage. He didn't even glance at the crowd. His eyes scanned the scene, found Amy Bennett, and locked on. Chief Wallace was half a step behind him, followed by a team of senior maintenance NCOs, who moved with the kind of disciplined urgency that signaled a major event was unfolding. The crowd, which had been murmuring, fell into a dead, reverent silence. Captain Davis stared, his mouth slightly agape. He had called for the cops to remove an old woman. Instead, the highest level of base leadership had arrived as if responding to a 4-alarm fire. He couldn't process what was happening. Colonel Matt strode past Davis as if he were a piece of unimportant scenery. He didn't stop, didn't speak to him, didn't even acknowledge his existence. His entire focus was on the woman in the leather jacket. He marched directly to Amy, stopped precisely 3 feet in front of her, and drew himself to his full height. Then, in a move that sent a shockwave through the assembled airmen, Colonel Matt, the wing commander, a man who commanded thousands of personnel and a fleet of deadly aircraft, snapped to the most rigid, impeccable salute Captain Davis had ever witnessed. It was not a casual salute. It was a salute of profound, almost worshipful respect. "Ms. Bennett," the colonel's voice boomed across the silent tarmac, sharp and clear. "It is an honor to have you on my flight line, ma'am." Amy Bennett looked at the colonel, at the silver eagle on his collar, and gave a slow, tired nod of acknowledgement. The salute was held. Matt then dropped his salute and turned, his eyes finally landing on Captain Davis. The look he gave him was not one of anger, but of cold, weaponized disappointment. He then addressed the entire crowd, his voice carrying the full weight of his command. "For those of you who were not aware," he began, his voice resonating with power, "you are standing in the presence of Major Amy Bennett, United States Air Force, retired, though she would be too humble to ever tell you herself." He gestured to the A-10 behind Amy. "This is not just any Warthog. This is Tail 780618. This is her aircraft. Major Bennett, then known as Dead-Eye Bennett, flew this exact airframe for over 2,000 hours. Nearly half of those were in combat." A ripple of awe went through the crowd. The airmen who had been slouched in discomfort now stood ramrod straight, their eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning reverence. "During Operation Desert Storm," the colonel continued, his voice rising, "Major Bennett was credited with the confirmed destruction of 23 T-72 tanks, 16 armored personnel carriers, and over 30 artillery pieces, more enemy armor than any other single pilot in the theater of operations." He paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in. Then he pointed directly at the faded scorpion patch on Amy's jacket. "And this patch, Captain Davis, is not from a bingo team. This patch was given to her by the commander of the 3rd Ranger Battalion. It was given to her after a mission where Major Bennett, flying this plane, single-handedly engaged and destroyed an entire enemy mechanized company that had ambushed and surrounded a platoon of Army Rangers. She saved every single one of them. She did so after taking a missile hit to her starboard engine, and she flew this bird back to base with half a wing on fire and hundreds of shrapnel holes in the fuselage. She refused to eject because she was worried the plane would crash into a civilian village. The story hung in the air, a stunning testament to the quiet, unassuming woman standing before them. Colonel Matt now turned the full force of his glare onto the pale, trembling Captain Davis. "Captain," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing level that was far more terrifying than a shout. "You will be in my office tomorrow morning at 0600 hours in your service dress uniform. You will be prepared to explain to me in excruciating detail why you felt it was appropriate to humiliate a decorated hero of the United States Air Force. You will explain your absolute failure of leadership, of judgment, and of basic human decency. You will explain why you still deserve the privilege of wearing that uniform because, from where I'm standing, you have profoundly disgraced it today. Am I understood?" "Yes, Colonel," Davis whispered, his voice barely audible. Matt turned back to Amy, his expression softening immediately. "Ma'am, on behalf of the entire wing, I am deeply and profoundly sorry for the disrespect you were shown here today." Amy Bennett finally spoke, her voice calm and steady, carrying a wisdom that made everyone lean in to listen. "He's young, Colonel. All he sees is the uniform, the rank, the rules of the present. He doesn't see the woman who wore it a lifetime ago. He looks at this airplane and sees an old, obsolete machine. He doesn't see the history written on its skin, the souls it carried, or the lives it saved on the ground." She looked past the colonel, her gaze sweeping over the young airman. "Respect isn't about saluting the person in front of you. It's about remembering the sacrifices of everyone who came before you. Without that memory, the uniform is just a costume." As she spoke of memory, one last image flashed in her mind, sharp and clear, not of fire in combat, but of the quiet aftermath. She saw herself, much younger, standing on the flight line in a Saudi Arabian desert base next to her battered, smoking A-10. A young army captain, his face covered in grime and streaked with tears of relief, was pressing a small, hand-stitched patch into her hand. The Scorpion patch. "We wouldn't be here without you, ma'am," the ranger had said, his voice thick with an emotion too raw for words. "The men, they wanted you to have this. You're one of us now. You're a sand scorpion." The patch wasn't a decoration. It was a contract, a symbol of lives saved, of a debt that could never truly be repaid, but would always be remembered. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from that day on the flight line was swift and decisive. Captain Davis was formally reprimanded and quietly reassigned to a dreary desk job at a remote logistics command. His once promising career as a pilot was effectively over. Colonel Matt, true to his word, instituted a new mandatory professional development course for all officers in the wing, focused entirely on Air Force heritage, with the story of Major Amy Bennett and Tail 78-061 as its opening lesson. The wing officially dedicated the aircraft, mounting a gleaming bronze plaque just below the cockpit that detailed the heroic service of the plane and its legendary pilot. About a month later, Amy was sitting in a small off-base coffee shop, reading the morning paper. The bell over the door jingled, and in walked a man in civilian clothes, his shoulders slumped, his face tired. It was the former Captain Davis. He saw Amy, froze for a moment, and then, after a long hesitation, walked over to the table. He stood there awkwardly, not sure what to say. Amy looked up from her paper, her expression neutral, waiting. Finally, the man spoke, his voice quiet and stripped of all its former arrogance. "Ma'am," he began, "I know an apology isn't enough, but I wanted you to know they made me read your entire service record, every mission report, every citation." He swallowed hard. "I just wanted to say thank you for your service." It wasn't the groveling apology Amy might have expected. It was something better. It was a statement of newfound understanding, of a painful lesson learned. Amy Bennett simply nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, of closure. On the flight line, Airman Garcia would often take new mechanics out to tail 78-0618. He'd point to the plaque, and then he'd point to the faded, almost invisible scorch marks still visible on the right engine if you caught the light just right. And he would tell them the story of the day a living legend came back to visit her old warrior and reminded an entire base what true valor looks like.